And essentially what we're going to talk about is 3 or 4 things. A little bit about the type of world we're living in. What are some of the disruptive forces that are going to matter in the future? So what's the context? That's the first part. I'm then going to talk a bit about, therefore, what does the organization of the future need to look like? And then finally, what are the type of leadership skills that we need to survive or to thrive in that type of a construct? And how do we develop them? So that's essentially what I want to kind of cover. The first one is where economic activity happens. So if you see this little graph that's playing out on the screen, at the start of the 180, when Jesus was living, the center of economic activity in the earth, if you do a weighted average, was actually somewhere between the border of India and China. And it stayed that way for a very, very long time. In the last 60 to 80 years, it actually moved towards the west on account of the Industrial Revolution, and then it moved further west because of Japan. So essentially 50% of the world GDP by 2025 will be from middleweight cities in emerging markets. The phone took 75 years to reach 50 million customers. Television took 13 years. Does anyone know how many years it took Angry Birds to reach 50 million customers? It was 35 days. Okay? The time between technological advances is greatly reducing. The third is an aging world. If you look at this map, the red part of the map is essentially where the share of population, 1 in 4 people will be above 65 years, and that includes China, by the way. Right? So that's again an aging world. In advanced economies, there'll be 13 retirees for every 10 children. The last trend is that trade flows. So in 1990, there were about $2 trillion of trade flows around the world. In 2013, that's become about 11 to 15 trillion. So there's much more interconnectedness within the world. It's actually quite dramatic if you look at the actual numbers. There's also much more flow from east to west and so on and so forth. Next level of evolution of organizations, and there aren't many like that today, is more in sense of what you might call a living organism, which is something that can morph and change and deal with the adapting times, like little bit like a living being does, right? Which is grow and morph and change in many different ways. And I want to spend some time talking about this. Now, in order to be able to live into this type of an organization, there are 4 things that an organizations will need to have to be able to do. And I'm going to talk about these, but I'm going to share them with you and then talk about each of them in some depth. The first is, and we call them the 4 paradoxes because they actually are paradoxes. So one is, how can I become highly stable, which is efficient, and highly dynamic at the same time? That's the first one. The second is, how can I change less by changing constantly? How can I move faster by getting more people involved? And finally, how can I get control by giving up control? So an organization that's very quick, can do things very fast, but is not at all stable, is what you might call a startup type organization. And any startup by definition would automatically fall into this category. If an organization is not able to really evolve properly, what might happen is you might lose your speed, but you still don't have stability, in which case you become what we call a trapped organization. Organizations that have a lot of stability, so everything's stable and nice and sweet and balmy, but they don't have speed, is what we call bureaucratic organizations. And those that have speed and stability are agile organizations. Was that the organizations that were agile much more successful in terms of output metrics, in terms of money they made, in terms of performance and so on and so forth, than the organizations that were not. So what is it that actually creates an agile organization? It's actually 2 things, right? So you need to create a stable backbone and a dynamic capability, both together. So let me give you 1 or 2 examples of organizations that have actually done this, and then we'll kind of move on to the next paradox. So Spotify, you all have heard of Spotify, essentially have an operating model where they have autonomous squads that actually kind of work very independently, go out and do a whole bunch of stuff, but then are connected through, in some ways, through some institutionalized systems. And they form highly effective informal kind of networks. A better example actually is ING, which is a big bank and which has been there for decades. So their journey of going from where they were to agile required some massive shifts right? So moving from 5 layers to 3, and disbanding 30 organizational units at the HQ. This is not across the whole bank. Disbanding 30 organizational units and making what they call 13 tribes. So it's very interesting, and I'll show you what they mean by that. And of course, as a consequence, there are 30% less people. So a tribe is, in their parlance, made up of what they call chapters and squads. So chapters are groups of people that have functional expertise. So they have know-how, like customer experience, marketing, and so on and so forth. And squads are business customer facing. So they have cross-functional people in them. And essentially, they created a tribe will have a combination of a few chapters and squads and kind of work together in that manner. So it's it seems complicated, and we don't have a lot of time to describe it, but it's very different than what how an organization would normally work and would normally kind of structure. And some of these are the elements that allow them to play this role of being very stable and dynamic at the same time. Almost 60% of organizations have made some redesign in the last 2 years, of which only a quarter have actually kind of succeeded. And there are some great examples of organizations that do this over time very successfully. This slide might be hard for you to read, but essentially a case of Alibaba, the Chinese internet giant, which started off as a B2B player, and then in the first few years actually created a C2C platform, but let it kind of happen kind of organically on its own, and then kept morphing into adding different elements. Another example is Hire, which had what you call a top-down pyramid before 2005, moved into more self-operating units, and then now has moved into micro enterprises. The third is moving faster by getting more people involved. So Huawei actually has a rotating CEO. So they have a rotating CEO who takes over every 6 months, right? So you have much more people involved. They have a management committee that is created by election. So the last point is, can I get more control by giving up control? It's another paradox in a sense. 12 skills we identified based actually on a lot of conversations with Fortune 500 CEOs, really. That's the source of this, right? With a lot of Fortune 500 CEOs as to what really kind of matters. And they fall into 3 buckets, which is what leaders do, how leaders interact, and who leaders are. The first thing is what we call telescope and microscope, which means that you need to be able to manage the here and now with great amount of rigor and depth, as well as look ahead into the future. The second one is we need to be ready for trend breaks, which is how can we as a leader recognize breaks, trend breaks, and act. A tri-sector athlete, that means being able to act in the private domain, which we all typically act in, the government domain, and the social domain. So how can you as a leader actually manage all 3? And you realize why that's important in today's day and age, right? Whether you're trying to do a new project or you're trying to do anything. And finally, being a receptor and a connector. Until now, people pretty much took decisions based on one of 2 things. Either patterns from the past, that's how most of us take decisions, or your gut. You agree with me? That's the 2 basic ways of taking decisions. Now the problem is that as the world becomes more complex, the patterns don't really matter because they're irrelevant. And it's too complex for you to take gut decisions. So the only way to take decisions is if you're able to talk to 30 people, understand what's going on, and work in a very different way. Then we move to who leaders are. So there's one which is what we call a strong sense of purpose. So a really strong sense of purpose in knowing what you want to do and so on and so forth. Being calm in the eye of a hurricane, that's not uncommon. As you can imagine, leader, poor fellow will have to do that if you're dealing with today's day and age. Always on. A marathon and a sprint, which is you need to be there for the long haul, but you need to be able to run fast. So how do you manage your energy? In fact, and we'll spend some time on it if we have towards the end, we can now say that managing energy is almost more important than managing time. How do we actually develop people to be able to do this? And the answer is the following. The idea here is that our leadership development very often tends to be what we call incremental, which is I have identified some learning need and I'll do something and I might have some coaching and I might send you to a program, and at the end of 1 year you're slightly better than what you were. And that actually has 3 elements to it, or 2 or 3 elements to it, right? Which is a combination of the latest in adult learning, neuroscience, analytics, and so on and so forth. So all the latest thinking you can think about in learning, shifting in root perspectives and mindsets, and self-mastery and managing personal energy.